Moses had led Israel for decades. He had stood before Pharaoh. He had witnessed the plagues of Egypt. He had seen the Red Sea divided. He had spoken with God. He had carried God's instructions to an entire nation. And yet, near the end of his life, Moses made one mistake at a rock. And because of that moment, God told him that he would not enter the promised land. That seems incredibly harsh. How could one moment keep Moses out after everything he had done? And what exactly did Moses do wrong? Was it simply that he struck the rock instead of speaking to it? Or was something much deeper happening? Let's look at the story. The story takes place in Numbers chapter 20. The Israelites arrived at a place called Kadesh. And once again, there was no water. This wasn't the first time Israel had complained about water. Throughout their journey through the wilderness, lack of water had repeatedly become a crisis. The people gathered against Moses and Aaron. They complained. They questioned why they had been brought out of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron went before God. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then God gave Moses very specific instructions. He told him to take the staff, gather the people, and then speak to the rock before them. God promised that water would come out. Moses gathered the people. So far, everything seems fine. But then Moses spoke harshly to them. He said, "Listen, you rebels." And then he asked, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his staff. And instead of simply speaking to the rock as God had commanded, he struck it. Not once, twice, and water came out. The people received water. So from the outside, it almost looks like everything worked. The miracle happened. But God was not pleased. God told Moses and Aaron that because they had not trusted him enough to uphold him as holy before the Israelites, they would not bring the community into the land God had given them. Think about that. The water came out, the miracle happened, but Moses had still disobeyed God's instruction. And that teaches us something important. A successful outcome doesn't automatically mean we followed God correctly. The fact that water came out of the rock didn't erase Moses' disobedience. So what was Moses' actual mistake? Many people summarize the story by saying, Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it. That's certainly part of the story, but the biblical explanation goes deeper. God said Moses and Aaron failed to trust him and failed to uphold him as holy before the people. So the issue wasn't merely, you used the wrong physical action. The deeper issue was what Moses communicated about God. Moses had been given an opportunity to show Israel that God would provide simply because God had spoken. But instead, Moses' words and actions shifted attention toward himself. Listen to what he said. "Must we bring you water out of this rock? Must we bring you water?" God was the one providing the water. Moses was God's servant. The miracle belonged to God. But Moses' response blurred that distinction. Moses was frustrated. We should also remember the context. Moses wasn't dealing with an easy group of people. For years, Israel had complained. They complained about food. They complained about water. They complained about the wilderness. They questioned Moses' leadership. They repeatedly struggled to trust God. So by Numbers 20, Moses was exhausted. He was frustrated. And that frustration appears in his response. He called the people rebels. He struck the rock twice. His actions communicated anger at a moment when God had instructed him to demonstrate God's holiness and provision. This is an important reminder. Being frustrated doesn't give us permission to disobey. This is where we need to understand Moses' unique responsibility. Moses wasn't just an ordinary Israelite. He was the leader of the nation. God had entrusted him with enormous responsibility. And leaders don't only receive instructions for themselves. Their actions teach the people watching them. Moses' behavior at the rock communicated something to the entire nation. God wanted Israel to see his holiness. Instead, Moses' response became a distorted representation of God's character. That's why the consequence was serious. Here's something fascinating. Even though Moses disobeyed, the water still came out. Why? Because God's provision for Israel didn't depend on Moses being perfect. God remained faithful to his people. But Moses' personal disobedience still had consequences. God can accomplish his purposes even when his servants fail. But that doesn't mean failure doesn't matter. Moses was not rejected by God. It's also important not to misunderstand what happened. Moses being prevented from entering Canaan doesn't mean that God abandoned him. Moses remained God's servant. God continued to speak with him. He simply wasn't permitted to enter it. That distinction matters. Discipline isn't always the same thing as rejection. There's another detail that makes this story even more interesting. Earlier in Israel's journey, in Exodus chapter 17, the people also needed water. God told Moses to strike a rock. And water came out. Years later, in Numbers 20, another water crisis happened. But this time, God told Moses to speak to the rock. The instructions were different, and Moses didn't follow them. Yesterday's instruction isn't automatically today's instruction. We need to listen to God rather than simply assuming that because something worked one way before, we should always do it the same way. The Bible later connects the wilderness experience with Christ. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 about the Israelites and refers to the spiritual rock associated with them. For Christians, the story points beyond Moses and the wilderness. God is the one who provides. God is the one who sustains. And ultimately, the Bible's story moves toward Christ. Moses' story should make every Christian leader pause. People are watching. Our actions communicate something about God. When we're angry, how do we treat people? When we're frustrated, do we still obey? When people disappoint us, do we represent God's character accurately? Your frustration can become someone else's picture of what you believe God is like. We often think obedience is only important when the command makes sense to us. But God told Moses to speak to a rock. That may have seemed unusual. Moses had seen God provide water from a rock before. Perhaps striking the rock seemed like a reasonable method. But obedience isn't, I'll do what God said as long as I understand why. Obedience means trusting God enough to follow what he has actually said. Moses eventually stood on Mount Nebo. From there, God allowed him to see the promised land. He could see the destination, but he would not enter it. For someone who had spent decades leading Israel toward that land, that must have been an incredibly significant moment. Yet Moses' story doesn't end in failure. He remains one of the central figures in the biblical story. His life demonstrates both God's faithfulness and the seriousness of leadership and obedience. So was it really just one mistake? Not exactly. The rock incident was one event, but the consequence was connected to what Moses and Aaron communicated about God's holiness. The problem wasn't that God was waiting for an excuse to punish Moses. The problem was that Moses had been entrusted with representing God before the nation, and at this crucial moment, he failed to do so properly. That's why the story is so sobering. What can we learn? Moses' story gives us several lessons. First, good intentions don't replace obedience. Moses wanted to give the people water, but God's instructions still mattered. Second, anger can distort our judgment. Moses was frustrated, and his frustration affected his response. Third, leaders carry responsibility. The people watching us can be influenced by our actions. God remains faithful even when people fail. The water still came. God still cared for Israel. And finally, God's holiness matters. We shouldn't reduce God to whatever version makes us most comfortable. He is loving. He is merciful. And he is holy. Moses didn't miss the promised land because God suddenly stopped loving him. He missed it because his actions at the rock represented a serious failure to trust God and honor him before the people. And perhaps the most important lesson isn't simply, don't strike the rock. It's this, don't allow frustration to make you misrepresent God. When you're angry, obey. When you're tired, obey. When people are difficult, obey. When God's instructions don't make sense, trust him. Because sometimes the most important moments of obedience happen when we're under the greatest pressure. Moses had spent decades walking with God, but one moment of disobedience carried serious consequences. That doesn't make Moses' entire life a failure. It reminds us that faithfulness matters all the way to the end. And it reminds us that God's holiness should never be treated casually. If this helped you understand the story of Moses and the rock, subscribe to Bible Stories Made Simple for more Bible stories and difficult passages explained simply.